Sometimes I forget just how controversial Jesus can be. And in those moments, I'm reminded of what has become a rule of thumb in my own personal life of faith. That if my mental picture, if our mental picture of Jesus is of someone who would never do or say anything controversial or provocative enough to get himself crucified, it's a sign we've replaced Jesus with a cardboard cutout in our own image. Or like that famous line of Anne Lamott, when our mental picture of God hates all the same people that we do, it's a pretty sure sign we've confused the real God with an idol. This coming Sunday, we hear a story that I don't know about you, but I grew up hearing. It was a regular part of our worship life, but I'm not sure that I really understood just what a slap in the face this story not only was to Jesus' first century hearers, but maybe still should be to respectable religious people, even religious professionals like myself. The story comes out of Luke chapter 18, and it goes like this. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. I think part of what makes a story like this so controversial is that the people that you expect to be the hero and the villain are turned upside down. Now, for a lot of church folk who've heard a lot of stories where Pharisees figure in and turn out to be kind of opponents of Jesus, we can sort of make the mistake of thinking that Pharisees were villainous figures back in Jesus' day, that everybody saw them as bad people, when just the opposite. We Christians have added centuries of maligning this group who, in a lot of ways, are very, very close to Jesus' teachings in so many ways, at least compared to all the other groups that were there in the first century in Judaism. The Pharisees and Jesus are so close in so many ways that it's the points where they disagree that the friction is the hottest. But nobody looks at Pharisees back in the ancient world and goes, villain. They go, that's the model, respectable, religious person, right? They're not all caught up with power like the Sadducees, who have sort of sold out to the Romans for cushy positions running the temple. They're not advocating for violent revolution. They're people who are, decent, respectable people who wear their religion publicly and want everybody to know about their piety and their devotion. They're seen as people who take their faith in God seriously in every part of their lives. In so many ways, the Pharisees in Jesus' day are regular, faithful, church-going people in our culture, people who are happy to let other people know they are religious people who believe in God. This is, the folks who have the, cross necklace and fish bumper sticker, the people who share social media memes on their Facebook page or whatever with Bible verses to let everybody know about how devout they are. They're people who insist that they practice their faith in daily life. And that's exactly who you expect to be the hero of the story. And that tax collector in Jesus' story is easy to be the villain in the first century. Everybody expects somebody like that to be the negative example. They're the people who have sold out to the Romans, basically, who are willing to cheat their own people, who are willing to extort their own people and take the money that they take, not just to make themselves rich, but to pass along taxes to the Romans, the empire that's oppressing them. Everybody hates tax collectors in Jesus' world, not just because they are sometimes suspect of being cheaters, but because they picked sides and they picked the wrong side. They sided with that godless government instead of with the righteous and holy people of God, right? And the Pharisee, by contrast, is sort of the person who embodies respectable religion. And yet in Jesus' story, the Pharisee doing what Pharisees do, right? Announcing their religiosity, showing how pious they are. He doesn't get it. He just doesn't get it. In Jesus' story, It's the person who recognizes what a mess he is, who's lifted up as the example. You can imagine everybody hearing this story of Jesus and being angered by it. Jesus regularly gets accused of blasphemy, of saying things that are not right about God, or claiming things for God that only God gets to claim. I don't think it's that Jesus attacks God so much as Jesus attacks people's assumptions about how God operates. And the assumption, not only in the first century, but today, is in so many ways that God operates on some kind of reward system, that you do enough pious stuff over here, pick things from the list, tithe, pray, show up in the temple, give to your church, put the right bumper sticker on your donkey or on your car, and that's sort of how you show you've got God's favor. And Jesus comes and wrecks that thinking every time. In story after story, in teaching after teaching, Jesus wrecks that whole notion that God is some kind of mechanical cosmic vending machine where you put in the right input, do the right good deed, do the right piety, and then you get some kind of reward or blessing or status. And instead, Jesus seems to insist that the moment I use my faith as a way to compare how I'm better than somebody else, I've completely missed the point. The moment I use my faith to look down on somebody else who I think is more of a sinner or worse than me, or doesn't take their faith seriously, or doesn't love the Word of God like I do, the moment I use my faith as a weapon against somebody else, or a boot to keep them down and push myself up, Jesus says I've missed the point of what faith was about in the first place. And to be honest, God can't use even my best good deeds. What God can use is my empty-handed surrender. What God can use is my acknowledgement of the messes that I've made. God can use truth-telling about, man, I screwed up again. And maybe this points to a really difficult but necessary truth for us, that Christianity, the Christian faith, is not a program for moral self-improvement, for us to get better and better behaved, more and more polite, more and more respectable, but rather about a God who comes and meets us in our deadness, in our brokenness, in our messiness, and raises us to new life right where we are. There's this really beautiful but also challenging line that I can't shake that comes from the late theologian and writer Robert Farrar Capon, who famously says, Jesus came to raise the dead, not to reform the reformable, not to improve the improvable. And he goes on, as long as you're struggling like the Pharisee to be alive in your own eyes, and to the precise degree that your struggles are for what is holy, just, and good, you will resent the apparent indifference to your pains that God shows in making the effortless of death the touchstone of your justification. Only when you're finally able, with the tax collector, with the publican, to admit that you're dead will you be able to stop balking at grace. That's just it. The gospel isn't that Jesus gives us a list of things that if we do them well enough will put us in the top rung of spirituality and make us better than other people so we get into God's club. The good news is that when all we can say is, I'm a screw up, I messed up again, God, please have mercy on me, that's all it ever took. In fact, before we even said the words, grace had scooped us up and claimed us and loved us. That smashes our usual understanding of what religion and religiosity is. And it means that all those things that we sometimes do in public to help other people know what pious, respectable, good, and well-behaved people we are like dust and ashes to God. That God is simply not interested in the things we do as public shows of how religious or pious or devout we are. But instead, God's interested in our honesty. And maybe that we not use that faith as a way to push people away or put people down, but rather to meet people who are fellow strugglers like us, and to say there's mercy for you if there's mercy for me as well. That's an ongoing challenge. But to be honest, I think the watching world, the listening world, is tired of religious people just announcing to the world how religious they are, announcing to the world how pious and righteous they are. Maybe what the world most deeply needs is some honesty. That like the tax collector, we are stuck in systems that are beyond our control and bigger than us. That sometimes it feels like we can't help but keep screwing up, that we can't help but mess up, that no matter what we do, we are entangled in rottenness. And even when we want to do better, we struggle at it. Maybe what the world most deeply needs is not somebody scolding them or saying, you're not as good as I am, but rather we're a bunch of mess-ups. Come join the club. Come join the family of people who've met the grace of God. That's exactly where this story ends, right? That it's not the respectable religious person who goes home justified, but the tax collector who hasn't even promised to change his ways. Nowhere in his prayer is, I promise God I'm not going to do anything that anybody would regard as sinful anymore, but rather, I'm just a mess-up and I need your mercy, and that's it. There is no, well, go and sin no more, tax collector. He doesn't say any of that. There's simply the admission, I'm stuck and all I need is mercy. So let's dispense once and for all with the notion that Jesus is neutral on matters like this. That Jesus just says, look, pious, impious, I don't get. Jesus clearly takes a side against respectable religion in this story and in favor of honesty, that is able to say, I'm a mess up and I need help. And maybe I've gotten myself into this trouble, and maybe it's something that's been forced on me, but I'm a mess up and I need help. That's where God meets us. That's the conversation that we're having this Sunday. How to move ourselves away from the temptation to be respectable religious people and instead to be honest about the mess we find ourselves in, and how to live there and discover grace has met us there already with the effortlessness, as Capon says, of our own empty hands and our deadness, letting God raise us to new life. That's where we're headed this Sunday.